Hi, I'm Mark Liebman. I'm a retired Navy captain and naval aviator. And I'm also a novelist that has 15 books in print in 3 different genres. And I'm also an aviation historian. Today I'm going to talk about the B-26 Marauder and a bit of its history and why it got an ugly reputation as an airplane that was hard to fly. And yet, when you look at its combat record, it had one of the best combat records of any bomber flown by the United States Army Air Forces in both Europe as well as in the Pacific. So the idea of a medium bomber was not new when World War II came about. The United States Army Air Corps, as it was known in those days, had been developing specifications and actually tried to buy an airplane that had performance that really wasn't available due to engines and technology and a few other reasons in the early 1930s. So they bought 3 different airplanes, 2 from Douglas, the B-18 and the B-23, and the Martin B-10. And they bought a fair number of them and began to experiment with the airplane. But none of these airplanes met the statistics or the requirements for performance that they really wanted. So they let this thing called the AC-39-640, and it was a specification for a new medium bomber. Now, Martin won the contract, and one of the reasons it won it was because what you see on this slide, they had extensive experience building or designing and building multi-engine airplanes, and you can see the quantities and types, and again, when they were first entered service. So by the time 1940 and 41 rolls around, Martin has a pretty good reputation. Part of the problem was that they had had a lot of contracts with the French and the British, which I'll get into in a second. So 39-640 came out with some specifications: a 5-man crew, 3,000 pounds over 2,000 miles, be able to cruise at 250 miles an hour, with a maximum speed close to 3, with 350 desired, which is kind of interesting, and armament of 4 30 caliber machine guns. And they asked the manufacturers to design an airplane around either the R-2800 or the R-3350. At the time, the 2800 was already in production. It was being now put on the P-47 and the Corsair, and the Hellcat. So it was much more farther along in development than the 3350. So all the manufacturers settled on the R-2800. So Martin wins the contract, but they had just won a contract for the Maryland, which is a twin-engine bomber for the French, the Baltimores, which was a different airplane, but based on looks like a Maryland, and for 1,500 of those. And then they had a contract for the Navy for the P-5M flying boat. And so they limited the initial order to 201 airplanes. The second finisher, which was North American, and its NA-62, received an order, and that airplane became known as the B-25. So the first B-26 flew in November of 1940. They sent it to Wright Field for flight testing, and it was the first airplane that had electrically controlled propellers and also an electrically controlled top turret. These are things that were later installed on the B-24s, the B-29s, and ultimately the B-17s. So the production begins, and ultimately there's 4 different models of the B-26 that were built. And this is a chart of all 4 of them, and I want to point out a couple things. Is number 1, they all use the R-2800. The horsepower increased over time as the engine was developed, but it had the same propellers. The big things that happened was, 1, the gross weight went from 34,000 pounds to 37,000 pounds. They extended the wing in the B model by about 2 feet to give it more wing area. And the airplane got heavier as they added more and more machine guns. So the first B-26As had 5, and the Bs, Cs, and Gs had 10. So what you can see in the bottom thing is the speed. The cruising speed at 15,000 feet was 75% power. And by the way, I pulled these numbers from the operating handbooks that I have on the Martin B-26. I actually have 3 of them, depending on the time of the war. The first one came out in 1943, well after the airplane started being flown in combat, and then the latter 2 came out in late 43 and 44. Anyway, but what you can see here is the reduction in cruising speed at 15,000 feet with roughly 75% power from 274 knots down to 233 knots. That's a pretty big decline, but yet it was still one of the fastest airplanes of its type or flown. So this is the B-26. I picked this one again for sentimental reasons. This is a B-26A. It was flown by my father in the 34th Bomb Squadron, 17th Bomb Group. They flew it all the way across the South Atlantic. They flew from the United States down the Caribbean, and then to Brazil, then to Ascension Island, then to Accra, Dakar, Casablanca, and then to war. In fact, in another video called The Thunderbirds Go to War, I talk about that story. But anyway, this is an A model. And what you can see are the gun positions. The B's, C's, and G's have a powered turret in the tail, but that's the only visible difference other than the 4 package guns which sit underneath or just after the cockpit. But typically they flew with 5 to 7 people depending on the mission. They normally didn't fly with an officer bombardier unless you were the lead airplane or of the strike, or maybe the second in command. Most of the time the radio operator doubled as the bombardier navigator, so he would drop the bombs on command or on the when he saw the bombs coming out from the flight lead. And then the ventral gunner was only carried on missions when they flew above 2,000 feet, or excuse me, 8,000 feet. And then the airplane had 2 bomb bays. Normally they didn't put anything in the aft bomb bay. During ferry missions, they filled they had a thing called bomb bay tanks, and that's what the aft bomb bay was used for mostly. The torpedo shackles, which I'll show a little bit later, are actually on the center line longer on because the bomb bay doors in the B-26 open to the side. They kind of fold like a door, and it allows you to hang a piece of heavy ordnance on the center line. So I mentioned the B-26 had problems. I'm not going to get into all the nuts and bolts of all the niggling problems because most airplanes have development problems, particularly in a situation where they literally bought a drawing and then they went to a prototype, and then before the airplane was fully tested, they went into production. So there were more than a few problems with the B-26. Number one were the propellers. There are 2 basic problems that were caused besides delivery. So Curtiss had trouble delivering the propellers, and so a lot of the airplanes literally sat out on the ramp without propellers, but they were finished other than that. The second thing is the propellers were electric. They were the first ones to be used on an airplane, and there's a computer disc, not computer, copper disc, in which the brushes, just like inside of an electric motor, rubbed against. And so when the propeller is turning, the brushes provided current, and then the current provided the control of the propellers to change the pitch of the blades. So what was happening was the brushes were out of adjustment, and you couldn't control the blades. Sometimes you got not enough pitch, or the thing went to what they call full fine pitch, or it was in a full decrease, which means the blades were taking big chunks out of the air. Either way, you couldn't control the propeller. And then the worst thing would happen is you had what they call a runaway propeller, which meant that it went to fine pitch and the engine at full power just kept generating RPM, and eventually both the propeller and the engine would fail. Sometimes the propeller actually came off the airplane. So that once they figured out the brush problem, it was just a matter of learning how to adjust them in the field. And then the other thing was that the R2800s had some developmental problems, and there are component failures. Most of these failed when the engine was at full power, and then they were reducing the throttle when they were coming out of takeoff power to go to climb power, and something would happen, something would fail in the engine because of sudden reduction in the power being demanded, the fuel flow, whatever one you want to use, but the stress on the internal components, and something would break. So all these were solved ultimately by changing the manufacturing processes, and the R2800 went on, like the R1820, to be one of the most reliable piston engines ever built. But in 1941, early 1942, the engine had some teething problems. So the teething problems led to some ugly nicknames for the B-26. One of which, and you can see, was that came out of a saying from the squadron, the training squadrons at what's now MacDill Air Force Base, 1 a day in Tampa Bay. It meant that one airplane every day crashed into Tampa Bay. It's a bit of an exaggeration, But these are the four names that people referred to the airplane: the Flying Prostitute, the Widowmaker, the Flying Coffin, the Martin Murderer, all of which were earned because pilots are having trouble controlling the airplane when it was flying on single engine. And so I'll get into the whys and what the learnings that came out of it in a few minutes. But this also led to Jimmy Doodle coming back to Tampa, literally getting in a B-26, albeit it had half fuel, only one other person, no guns, no ammunition, no bombs, and he took off, and as the airplane rotated and was starting to lift off, he feathers the left engine. The right engine. So this is the critical engine. So in an airplane like the B-26, if you got full power in engines and you suddenly take off the right engine, that means the airplane's going to roll to the right unless you counter it with rudder and aileron. And if you're below VMC, minimum control airspeed, the airplane will roll uncontrollably. And if you're at low altitude, that's a bad thing. So what Doolittle did is he came by, made several passes at angles of bank with the engine what's called caged or feathered or at parade rest, whatever terms you want to use for it. And he demonstrated the airplane was eminently controllable single engine. The nicknames I think were kind of odd because it really wasn't, they really weren't deserved because other airplanes had teething problems. So if you look at the accident rates or the accidents, the non-combat accidents in both the B-25 and the B-26 over the service life, you'll notice that the B-26 had fewer accidents than the B-25. And this is the statistic by year pulled from the United States Army Air Force's own numbers. So why did the airplane became much more, I'll use the word pilot friendly, and why did the airplane begin, once it was being flown in combat, earn a pretty good reputation? Well, number one is the fact that the amount of thrust or power you're getting out of the R2800 increased as the B-26 models, the newer models. So the B, Cs, and Gs had more power than the A models. And then the other thing is a little bit more wing area. So what you see here is that the power loading, in other words, the pounds of airplane that's being dragged through the air by the propellers or the engines actually decreased as you moved up in the later models. So the G had a much better power loading or power to weight ratio than the A or B. So this plus the fact that the wing area was slightly increased meant that the airplane was much more controllable single engine because you had more power than you did in the earlier models. Then the other thing is that as the airplane and the experience with the airplane increased, we started to learn things that we sort of knew but got perfected. So if you go back and look at the three flight manuals or pilot operating handbooks or pilot operating instructions, depending on what title you want to give them, that I have on the B-26 from late 1943 to the last one that came out in late 1944, they all had more and more detail about flying this airplane single engine, but they didn't have what we see down up here at the bottom, or what we call V-speeds today. These things have evolved over time, and now I'll use the 21st century, when you're learning to fly multi-engine airplanes, there's a whole plethora of these V-speeds. I only picked out 6 of them. V1 means that you're committed to going flying, you're about to or have rotated the airplane, which means you're going aviating. The second one is V2, is what's when you lift off the ground, so the airplane's now climbing, and then what you're trying to do at that point is get to what's known as VMC, minimum single engine control speed with one engine out. So if you lose an engine, you want to get to VMC or past VMC as fast as you can. So if you lose an engine, you can continue to fly the airplane. VREF is the best landing speed or approach speed. So you'll see if you fly corporate airplanes, you fly airliners, there'll be VREFs. Everybody has different policies. When I flew as a corporate pilot, we used to use REF plus 10 as our approach speed coming over the numbers. Then you have things like VX and VY, the best rate of climb, best angle of climb, airspeeds. All these things we have today, and if you look at the manuals from back then, they weren't listed. So they didn't even have a procedure that I learned early on when I was learning to fly multi-engine airplanes, which was dead foot, dead engine, which means that if you're needing to apply right rudder to keep the wings level and keep the airplane pointing in the right direction, that meant the left engine was dead because you weren't using your left foot, and vice versa. So if you weren't using your right foot, that meant the right engine had problems. But none of these things are in any of these flight manuals. So again, this is stuff that we learn later on, post-war, and as aviation technology and aviation training practices have evolved. So what kind of missions did the B-26 fly? So in my video, The Thunderbirds Go to War, I talk about two of them, level bombing and skip bombing. I just touch on torpedo attacks, which I'll get to a little bit more on this one. So level bombing, the medium bomber was designed to go after bridges and troop concentrations and railway yards and fly up between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, be fast enough so fighters would have trouble catching up to them. And that obviously didn't happen because Me-109s and FW-190s and the Mach-E 2000, 2002 all were faster than the B-26. So they were like the B-17s when they did level bombing, except they were at lower altitudes. And the fighters just rolled in on them. Skip bombing is something different. It was first tried by the Brits. It was perfected by the 5th Air Force in Southwest Asia. It's an attack where you're coming at very low level, typically masthead height. You drop bombs and they fly into the ship. I have a whole video again on skip bombing and how you fly a B-26, one of those attacks on my YouTube channel. You can go look at that. But the loss rates on skip bombing attacks are far lower than they were in the level bombing attacks because you're actually only in the area where you're going to take fire for a much shorter period of time. Then originally the B-26 was designed to carry torpedoes, and the original B-26As were delivered with torpedo shackles on the belly. And in fact, at Midway, 4 B-26s launched a torpedo attack or flew out to the Japanese fleet, dropped their torpedoes, none of them hit, and 2 made it back to Midway. The ones who used the torpedo as a weapon with the B-26 was the RAF and the Aegean. I'll talk more about that in a second. And the other missions they had was fast enough so you could tow sleeves for gunnery training for fighters. They did some mining with it. Again, that was mostly the RAF, and then long-range reconnaissance. The Japanese Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces said in several different things, these are just a couple of quotes, that the B-26 is the best day bomber he'd ever in the world. The reason that the Army Air Corps and then Army Air Force stopped using the torpedo is you had to slow it to drop the Navy torpedo, which is what they were issued, to 120 to 130 miles an hour, which was about 20 to 30 miles an hour below the VMC. So in other words, you slow up, get to a point where if you got an engine that's hit, you're going to crash because you can't control the airplane, or it'll be difficult to control, and then you're going to drop the torpedo and you'll be straight and level while you're doing it. So the Air Force said no. They tried it a couple times in the Med, and then they went to skip bombing. But the RAF, different torpedo, different tactics, were much more comfortable doing it, and they were quite successful at it. So I love this photo because you can see the guy sitting in the nose in the bombardier station, the 2 pilots, and that's probably the radio operator or the flight engineer between the 2 pilots. And you can see the package guns on the nose, and you can see how crowded everybody is together. And so the B-26 was flown in the European and Pacific theaters, and it's flown by the Air Force, the Free French, the RAF, the Royal Australian Air Force, and interestingly enough, the South African Air Force. So I said early on that the B-26 had a heck of a reputation as being very survivable. These are 2 photos of 17th Bomb Group airplanes. Both have been pretty badly shot up. They're both flying single engine. And the thing that is most interesting, it had a 0.5% loss rate per mission, and it was the lowest of any bomber flown by the Allies in World War II, which is kind of amazing given the fact that in the beginning it was not a well-liked airplane. So why did the Air Force stop building B-26s in 1944? And it was primarily money. You can see here the cost of the airplanes, and the B-26 was $50,000 more, almost to the penny, than it was to build a B-25. So the Army Air Corps decided, or Army Air Forces decided to stop making B-26s, and that plus the fact it was more expensive to maintain, and they decided to standardize on the B-25. So there are a couple famous airplanes. The Coffin was the first air bomber to survive 100 missions. It flew in the 17th Bomb Group, 34th Bomb Squadron. My dad flew a couple of those missions. It was brought back to the United States in 1943. It went on a bomb tour and then crashed in a landing accident. Had nothing to do with engine failures or anything like that. And then there's Flakmate, which is in the National Air and Space Museum. It was brought back initially as just the forward half of the airplane, and they now is restoring it to a full B-26, and it will be available. It was flown by the 449th Bomb Squadron. There are only 7 complete B-26s in existence, and there's only one that's flyable. It's owned by the Fantasy of Flight Museum in Florida. The difference between being flyable and airworthy means that it has all the bits and pieces, but it does not have has not had an inspection in which an FAA certified aviation power plants mechanic signs off the airplane as being airworthy, and it now can get insurance. He has not flown that airplane recently, but it has been flown since he acquired it, or the Fantasy Flight Museum has acquired it. So there's 6 others in museums around the world, and the Normandy Museum has one in actually U.S. colors and the D-Day markings in it, and the rest are out there for you to go look at. And you can see that they're mostly B's with just 2 G's. So I mentioned earlier I've published 15 books as of the moment. This is the covers. I hope you watch this video and the others on the B-26 that I have, and I can promise you there's going to be more coming. And thank you for watching, and please subscribe, and look forward to producing more.